So now, if everything works well, you now have one of my first slide in front of you, um, and this slide has a Dutch quote on it. It's actually a picture of a quote on a building, and here you have the other quote. It's Dutch, my native language, and in English in Dutch it's alles van waarde is weerloos, which translates in English to something like everything of value is defenseless. Sounds less nice in English though, which is a saying that's quite popular in the Netherlands. Look here, you have a lot of pictures of buildings and people even tattooing it on their arms. And that picture on the left top I find nice because it's an insurance company who placed that one on top of their building, which is ironic for an insurance company. But it says something which I think is relevant to what we're going to talk about today. And that is, how are we actually going to show that legal empowerment programs, what they contribute, what they do, is of value when that what is of value in these programs is actually not so easy to show. And that's the defenseless part of this quote. A lot of the things that are important and of value are actually not so easy to put in numbers or put in nice statistics as to convince our donors, and that makes our whole legal empowerment movement vulnerable to when talking about people who decide about big budgets and who can say, look, a vaccination program vaccinates 3,000 people and we know what it does. Now you show us the impact of your program if you want a similar amount of money. So here's a challenge that we all face: how to show that our programs actually make a difference in the world out there, and it's actually making the world a little bit better, when what we do is not as clear as vaccinating 4,000 children. So I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which we could do that, highlighting, as I said, just what these methods are, discussing a little bit the advantages and the drawbacks. And I'm not going to go fully over the ins and outs, the nuts and bolts of implementing them, because that would take too long. And I guess actually, when you hopefully will discuss this afterwards, you guys can have a lot of practical knowledge on this yourself. So this, you can see this also as a Kickstarter for discussion. So what we're going to do, basically, after some reflection on what actually impact assessment is, we're going to discuss 6 different research methods that you might employ to assess and study the impact of a legal empowerment program. And this could be used in combination, and I'll get back to that in the conclusions. So first of all, let's talk about what is it actually that we are talking about? What is impact of legal empowerment programs? So there's of course a lot of definitions of what empowerment is, what legal empowerment, with different emphases, but let's focus on the ones here on the screen, which has in some way or the other something to do with enhancing an individual's or group's capacity to make choices and to make those choices really matter. Now, if you take that definition, you see that actually empowerment has different dimensions. It's about enlarging the scope of choices that people have, giving people different choices, but it's also about helping people to make use of those choices, showing what the options are, and actually allowing people to access these options, and to make sure, that's the third one, that it has an impact, that it leads to outcomes that are desired. So applying this to legal empowerment here, this means not just that the legal empowerment program is not just about informing people about the different courses of actions that they could take to address a dispute or problem that they might have. It's also about making sure that people access these different forums or mechanisms that might lead to a solution, whether it's the court or in case of Indonesia and Pakistan, also a lot of informal dispute resolution mechanisms that are there. And thirdly, it's also about making sure that these different fora, these different mechanisms, actually work well, work honestly, fastly, and are not overly expensive, in a way that they actually offer a solution to your clients. So we're talking about these three kind of impacts. While that is the concrete impact, while the larger story that we have about around our programs are also about what it actually does to the development of a country, addressing poverty, improving governance, keeping governance to account, improving legal institutions, etc. So we have the empowerment part, which is one dimension, and we have the actual societal impacts, which is another dimension. So here, just an example of how impact was defined in this Pakistan project that we evaluated. Here you see we looked at quite a range of outcomes. First of all, we looked at what is the outcome in terms of cases. How often do people get the result they want? But also where do they go? And secondly, what impact does it have on the way in which people address these issues? And thirdly, and that's the broader societal impact here, what is the welfare? Do people gain bigger control over their resources and their lives and maybe their incomes through a program like that? And relatedly are community level impacts. So these are impacts on how is a community settling its disputes, and how do particularly informal dispute resolution mechanisms that are prevalent there, jirgas they were called, how do they operate and do they change as a result of this program? And thirdly is lastly is the impact of justice providers, the people who sit on jirgas as well as police. Do they have a different attitude, and do they start operating differently as a result of interaction with the program? And these are all range of impacts that a legal empowerment program might have. Not that it always succeeds, but these are just to show you different things that you could look at and how you could define impact. And this is just one way. Some of the programs you guys might have been doing might have been defining impact in a different way. What's important, of course, is to look at what is considered by the program as impact and to take that into account when designing the impact evaluation, while not limiting yourself to that definition, because there might be dimensions of impact that the program didn't think of beforehand, but became relevant. Or there might be negative forms of impact that the program didn't want to think of beforehand, is not formulated, of course, in a design like this, but could actually be an impact. For example, increased level of conflict because people feel more confident of expressing them. It's hardly ever mentioned as a goal of a program, but actually, arguably, I would say it's not a bad thing either. In some instances of big inequality like northwestern Pakistan, that some level of conflict emerging is actually not a bad thing, but this is a topic for discussion. So when we designed this program in Pakistan and we looked at the legal empowerment program there, we designed a methodology that was mixed. So we tried different things, and that's also, in that light, I would like you to think about the methods that I'm going to discuss after this. So we did a survey, a baseline survey, to get an idea of the needs and what kind of conflicts were prevalent, how people talked about them. Um, we tried a randomized controlled trial. I'll get back to that. We worked with case database. We also did detailed case tracking, and we tried to do some ethnographic village studies. I'll get back to all these methods in turn. So we start with doing surveys. This is quite common, usually through using a structured questionnaire, surveying target population, or at least the population in the area that you're going to do the program, to get an idea of what kind of conflicts are prevalent, how common are they, but also what are attitudes of people towards courts or other informal dispute resolution mechanisms. Where do they prefer to take their issues? Is it often to court or is it elsewhere? What do they think about the police, etc.? Very useful material also for planning. Not always so easy when it comes to evaluating the impact. First of all, to really be able to evaluate the impact, you would also need to do an end-line survey. So survey in the beginning, survey at the end, and see whether particular answers to particular questions change over time. So for example, what we had in mind of doing in Pakistan, which we didn't end up doing, was we asked people about knowledge about the law, about different legal provisions, and we wanted to see whether people were more knowledgeable towards the end of the program than they were beforehand. But you could also check changes in attitudes. So what we tried to do was work with hypotheticals, with stories like your mother, you have a daughter who ran off with a boy from the village, and he's there now in hiding. What do you think is the proper course of action? And then we had A, B, C. And we wanted to see what people would answer. Something like this you could then also ask through an end-line survey and then see if attitudes of people change. Now, I find personally a survey much more useful to get a broader idea of practices and attitudes that people have, more than assessing impact. Particularly because it's actually not so easy to prove that when you find a change between a baseline and end-line survey in answers, it's not so easy to prove that it's actually attributable to the program. It might be that there has been a lot of newspaper reports about a particular court case, and that through that a lot of people learned about different legal provisions, or there might have been elections, or there might have been other people providing new informations. So that's actually quite difficult to attribute change to something that a legal empowerment program has done. But in general, to conclude, it's more of a method to get a general overview of the challenges that a program might face and also the ways in which it might deal with attitudes and preferences of people. Now, a second method, which is more promising when it comes to assessing impact. Actually, this randomized control trials is in development circles really the hot thing, you might say, to prove impact and to show to the outside world that the money spent on development programs has an impact, because it has a neat way of showing impact. Let me start by explaining you the method. What it does, it divides the target population, whether that's areas, villages, or groups of people. It divides it into two, an intervention group and a control group. In the intervention group is the group that is actually being served by your program, by the program that you're doing. And the control group is not getting any kind of interaction with your program. But you, on both of these groups, you do a baseline survey and an endline survey. which means that for both of them on different dimensions of impact, you get a measurement of how knowledgeable people are about the law, their attitudes, how they feel about their confidence of solving problems themselves, how often, how likely they are to contact politicians, etc. And then you can compare whether the scores of the intervention group is higher or lower compared to the control group, which solves the problem that I just mentioned when discussing survey, that you really don't really know what caused the change. Because here, because you have an intervention and a control group, you know that all the other factors, newspapers, TV, elections, etc., were applicable to both. So if there's a change, then it has to be, if there's a difference between control and intervention group, this has to be due to the difference between that this particular intervention group has been served by a legal empowerment program. So that is a much more convincing method. The disadvantages is that it's quite expensive. You need to do a baseline endline survey, and it's also very challenging to execute well. One of them is that you have to, as a researcher, interact with the people implementing the program and making sure that they select the areas in which they work on the basis of your randomized selection. You have to randomize selection. That's what we did in Pakistan. We randomized selected villages that the program should work, areas, and where it shouldn't, and they should stick to it. Now that turned out to be quite difficult, partly in our case because another legal empowerment program started to work in our control area, and they're kind of damaging our control thing. The coordination of this selection is also quite difficult, and then the reality always often gets into the way, because when you have to travel far, program coordinators might find your selection not very practical when it means that they have to go far. So it's actually quite difficult. And one other drawback I want to mention is that you are focusing only on predetermined indicators that you decide on yourself, sitting behind your desk. This is what we want to measure, whether we see impact on, which means you're not open to dimensions of impact that your program might have had that you didn't think of beforehand, because it's not in your baseline survey, so you cannot measure it through an endline survey. Okay, very brief, I hope not too brief. So here is just how something like that might show in, you might present in a report where you have different variables on your left hand about whether people feel satisfied with the way in which, I think in this case, this is about how informal dispute resolution system worked and how it provided solutions. And then you see that the average of the intervention group, which is on the blue thing, is slightly higher than the average on the control side, which is the gray line. Even controlling for this is reliability intervals here, and then you see, then you can show, well, look, it had this impact, and you can even put it into percentages and say people are on the whole 10, 15, 20% more satisfied, for example. So that's useful, but it has these drawbacks that I mentioned. So now the third methods that you can employ to assess impact of your legal empowerment program, and that's using the case database that paralegals or legal empowerment staff, or however you call them, collect through their daily work. So they are working on cases, they're getting clients, and I guess you are asking them to note down what the case was about, when they came, what steps were undertaken, when there was an outcome, how long it took, etc. So that you could use all that is all relevant information to describe how a particular project functioned. And here, as you see in these two pictures, there are it gives you also basic information of what the program did, how many cases it got, whether it changed over time, etc. So these are all useful indicators of impact. Ideally, but I'll get back to that later, you could use that to compare with non-intervention cases, but I'm going to discuss that later. So the advantage of this method is that it gives you basic information. It's relatively easy to gather, although actually in the program in Pakistan it was quite difficult. We had to work hard to make sure that the staff had the discipline of record the cases well and record each progress and new development in a case. The disadvantage that you don't not really get to all the dimensions of what impact might be. You really get the basic stuff of was a case solved, how long did it take, was it fast, was it slow, were there many cases, were there not many cases, but actually not too much on like why was particular case method chosen, why did people go to court, why did people not go to court, and also when you find that particular types of conflicts, for example, are solved relatively successfully by your program, it's not so easy to assess why that was. What are the reasons for success? It gives you a lot of things, but not a deeper insight in what are the reasons for success or failure of your program. Now, the fourth method, which I'm going to discuss, is more like hinting at or highlighting to you how various forms of statistics that are out there might be useful actually to show you to show impact or to check impact of your program. There are a lot of government institutions that measure things, and this might sometimes, when your program has been running for some time, might be able to just show or at least suggest impact of your program when it's relevant. So here's the example. Here is the rate of consumer complaints by different. This is an example from American states. If you have a program that is working on facilitating people to lodge complaints with the government, then it makes sense to report those kind of statistics because they show that the number has gone up in this case. While it might not completely be attributable to your project fully, it might at least partly. It gives you a way to show that, hey, something has changed in the way, in this case, people deal with the government. And similarly, depending on your program, you could think about provision of civil registration cards. Are they handed out more? Are they demanded more? Do people go more often to the police? Do they register more cases? Has the registration of particular types of cases that your program has worked on, I don't know, domestic violence, maybe corruption complaints, has that gone up, and particularly in the areas where you're working, of course. Now, the good thing is that when this data is there, this is actually quite cheap. You can easily, there are some good government websites where you can just download some of this. So that's nice, but actually in many cases that we work on, where the areas that I worked and maybe also you work, this is not so easy. At least in Pakistan there was no way in which we could get reliable government statistics. And of course there's always the issue that I mentioned earlier also. You don't fully know whether the uptick in any kind of indicator that you might thought of in these statistics is due to your legal empowerment program or whether there's something else. But it's suggestive at least. So now we go to the fifth kind of approach that you might take to evaluating your legal empowerment program. And this is case tracking. This means documenting the emergence and handling of a dispute or grievance throughout its process. And this is a more qualitative method where you describe textually the chronology of a case, but also why things happened when they happened. So, why did you decide to take up this problem that you had? Why did you decide to take it to us as the legal empowerment program, or why did you take it first to an informal dispute resolution mechanism, or to a local authority, or why did you decide to go straight to the police? And then you follow that up with each of the steps that that a case goes through. But important in this kind of case tracking, so is that you do not only study the factualities, what happened, what was the outcome, but also why you interview people on why they took different steps and why they think certain outcomes were reached and why certain choices and strategic choices were made. And that is a way to get a much more fuller idea of what a legal empowerment program can do, but also the obstacles that it faces, because it gives you a much broader range of information. Here, just an example from 2 quotes from research that I did. Here you see, in the first quote, we asked why this woman managed to succeed in mediation to settle a conflict which she had with her brother-in-law. And she describes that she felt, look, I could never have gone to court, and my brother knows it. So during the earlier mediation sessions and discussions which I had, he never budged and he never wanted to agree to my demands. But then he saw that the LAP team could actually bring the case to court and there might be legal action. And that's when he relented and said, okay, I'll repay you the money for the land that I sold, which is actually yours. This is impact of the LAP program. Not only is it impact, it also shows the particular mechanism through which impact works. That it's not, in this case, it's not actually going to court that changes the outcome for the client. It's the threat that the courts are now accessible that changed the bargaining position that this woman had. And in that sense, it's important to those kind of remarks, important to show that the impact of legal empowerment programs are not just about accessing courts or getting verdicts, but in this case it shows you how even the shadow of accessing the courts influences mediation processes and creates an outcome. And a similar the second quote here is actually illustrating a similar thing, where a factory owner decided to settle an issue also because he felt that going to court would be much more expensive. So here the drawback is that for donors, this kind of impact, you're not putting in numbers or nice stats, or you can say our people are 20% happier because this and that. But you do show the mechanisms through which impact actually works, and it also gives you some insight when something does not work. Here, I didn't put those examples on the slides here, but you can imagine similarly, these interviews are also about why did efforts of a paralegal to mediate a case fail, or why did he not succeed in getting a case heard in court, for example. Now, on a topic I flagged earlier, on comparing intervention cases and control cases. That's what we did in Pakistan. We did this case tracking not just for cases that were handled by the legal empowerment program, but also we tried to find similar cases in adjacent areas that were not helped by in any way by legal empowerment program. So we selected 60 cases out of the case database that were supported by the program in the fields of divorce, land disputes, and inheritance. And then we found 60 more or less comparable cases that we called control cases. They were different. So we did the same process, studying the chronology and the motivation and the choices of people in these two types of cases. And through that method, we could compare we tried then in the second step to quantify the outcomes a little bit to the extent possible. So how long did it take, for example, for a case to reach a solution in the control and intervention cases? How often was a satisfactory solution reached, but also how often did people go to court? How often did people opt for informal dispute resolution? And in this way, we felt we were able to do a more a deeper form of impact assessment without looking only at some predetermined variables, but we were able to capture the complexity of cases on the one hand, but also provide some summary kind of statistics that also showed impact. Cases in these, and also sometimes did not show impact. So we showed how cases were actually dealt slightly faster with that when they were dealt with by the legal empowerment program, and we could show that actually people went to court less often, perhaps surprisingly, because for the mechanisms I just described, people more often opted for mediation and it worked more often, so people didn't have less reason to go to court. So that's in itself, that's an interesting finding that you could do through this kind of in-depth comparison of intervention cases and control cases. The challenge of such a method is that, first of all, it's somewhat time-consuming, and second is that it's not so easy to find exactly comparable cases. So there is a slight risk of apples and pears. When you get to higher numbers of cases, that problem dissipates, but that is a lot of work. So in that sense, we had to be modest in our conclusions that we can draw from this process. So there's a lot more to talk about that, but I'm just afraid that looking at slides will get you bored at some point. So I'm gonna move to the fifth or sixth approach to studying impact of legal empowerment programs, which I'm calling thick case description, or you might call it case tracking plus. Thick case description is actually a term taken from the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who talk about thick description as a way of describing anthropological research method. And it means not looking at only the chronology and context of a case, but also delving into the social context that informs the way in which people deal with the case. So it's, for example, being aware of the impact of social inequalities within a village that might shape why certain people decide not to take up an issue, or that they do not dare to go to court because they fear repercussions, etc. But with thick case description, I also mean being sensitive towards prevailing conceptions of justice and honor, and what kind of gender norms are common within these societies, the context in which you study, in which you work. Because all of these are important to understand not only how people usually deal with disputes and grievances, but it's also important to understand how people actually see a legal empowerment program and the challenges of implementing a program successfully. Just one example from the Pakistan program, um, particularly in the early months. Look, I've been talking a lot. Particularly in the early months, the paralegals of the program were often told by particularly men in their areas, you are just here to create problems within our marriages. You are just here to set up, to make women angry against us men, which was not a totally unfair kind of complaint, given that a lot of the legal awareness sessions that they have been organizing were about women's rights, what are legal provisions, what are the rights to, for example, inheritance or divorce, how does all that work? And given in an area where gender equality is quite stark, you can expect some sort of blowback, and you need to find a sensitive way to dealing with that, with those prevailing norms. And your whole success of a program actually depends sometimes on making such choices. Similar example I could give, but I'm not going to give, about interpreting and knowing how an informal dispute resolution mechanism works. In Pakistan, you have jirgas, which are councils of elders, which are very actually the preferred methods of choice to solve disputes because they're cheap and they are fast, but they're also male dominated and they apply a particular form of customary law which is even less, it's more detrimental to the interests of women than Sharia law. So in this case, Sharia law was the progressive option often. And all that kind of context stuff is important to know also when executing a program and when evaluating it. So that's why I'm mentioning, perhaps maybe because I feel myself an anthropologist, I'm emphasizing doing this part of research, which you do through, ideally through ethnography, which means a, a long-term immersion in a community in which you participate in daily life and you observe what people do and you gossip and talk on a daily basis about these activities and perceptions that people hold. Now, I see that this is not something that within a funded legal empowerment program with strict deadlines and strict outcome indicators you could easily do. There are big time constraints. I can see that. But you could be smart and find subtle ways in which you could still incorporate this in your research design. But for example, what we tried to do in our Pakistan research project, we did the interviews for the case tracking, but also the researchers always made sure they hung out at these tea stalls you have there, and were instructed to start up conversations with people about topics relevant to the research. So some gossiping, some talking, to get at least a broader feel of the topics that you're researching. And when it comes to, there are some drawbacks, of course, when it comes to really assessing the impact of a program. It gives you a very broad insight into what actually works and how it works, but it's not so easy sometimes to put it into a short, succinct report of the kind that the donors might want to see. It's more something you want to put into a book, which anyway might be nice to do. Okay, so now we've gone through these 6 different methods. If this were a workshop session and I would be there, I would have now asked you to talk among each other and think about which methods you would ideally, if you have a certain budget, would like to apply to evaluate your program. I don't, that's unfortunately not possible, but maybe you could do this after this recording gets over. And particularly, I encourage you to evaluate the pluses and minuses and the drawbacks, as well as the challenges of implementing them well. regarding implementation, just 2 more slides. Just a few general comments, and there's a lot that could be said about this. This is far from comprehensive. But I would like to emphasize that it's important to think about monitoring and evaluation activities at the start of your program, partly because you can actually employ methods that you cannot no longer do when you've already been very far in the program. For example, the randomized controlled trial, obvious, but also the baseline endline survey. But even the case tracking might be much more efficient when you decide the design beforehand in a way that you make sure that the case database that your staff collects is set up in a way that corresponds with the questions that an impact evaluation research program might have. So you integrate them. That's more efficient if you do it at the start of the program. Now, something about setting up the research program. In the Pakistan program, we had to work with researchers simply for the very practical reasons that security concerns did not allow me to travel to these areas, which was a bit of a weird experience for me to be researching from afar. So we worked with researchers, with 3 researchers in different areas. Often, I guess you have to do that. In general, my experience is it's better to work with a small team that you're able to instruct and supervise well, rather than a very big team that you have less quality control over. But sometimes you don't have the time, and sometimes you don't have the choice. But at least what's important is strict supervision, which is something for me also to learn a little bit. I thought first I'll give them the questions and the goals, and I let them do these researchers their interviews. But that does not always work out the way I hoped it would, in the sense that not all the questions that I thought would surely be asked were not asked. So in that sense, it's good to develop protocols, interview protocols, case report protocols, to make sure that everybody reports really the data that you want and that you need. Further, another general point that's very important is that you need to have good interaction with the program officers that implement the program, because they give you access to the case database, but also for all sorts of practical everyday interactions you need their help. So when designing this program and when executing it, it's very important to have a good discussion with program officers, explain what it is, why you're doing it, why it's important to implement it effectively. Now, these are just some very random general comments. Probably during discussions afterwards you might have much more. And then 3 general last conclusions. First of all, these 6 methods that I mentioned, they're not meant to choose just one. Often it makes sense to combine them, also because, as I highlighted in the slides, different methods evaluate or are better at getting at different dimensions of impact of your program. And personally, I feel that a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods is best, because it can show you outcomes in a succinct way, but which is what quantitative research can do, but also it helps you through the more qualitative interview-based fieldwork. It helps you to identify what are the mechanisms the reasons that lead to success or failure of the program, and what can be done about it. So that makes evaluating your program much more useful. Now, the last remark sounds very logical and commonsensical, but still that is a challenge. You need to really take time to design your research. You need to take time to train the researchers involved, and even if you've designed it well and you've thought of everything, the situation always changes, so you also need to be flexible and make sure to make on-the-spot effective decisions. So that's it. I hope looking at a PowerPoint like this did not get too boring, and I hope it didn't talk too long. And I wish you all a very productive and nice seminar for the remainder, and I hope to learn more about your programs in the future.